All right. I always wait to hear that. Wonderful. This meeting is being recorded. So I think we're good. So we will call to order this meeting of the Greater Albany Public Schools Board of Directors for our work session, January 20th, 2021 at 7:05 p.m. And as soon as our flag is up, if you will join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Chris. All right, so I am leading in board book again. You guys are welcome to either follow along or open things and follow on your own. And tonight we are joined again for our addressing educational equity conversation by Elaine. And I don't know, did Melissa or anybody want to have an open conversation? There you go.
Yeah, I'm happy to open it up on on this, a historic day, in terms of equity, both gender equity and racial equity. Seeing the representation of the new vice president being sworn into office and seeing Justice Sotomayor swearing her in. I think the how moving that moment was for me as an educational leader and as a woman in the country can't be overstated. Every child now that we have that grows up will know she can be in the executive branch. And that is a pretty amazing thing to realize. I think as we think about our own work in equity, one moment from today that may resonate with those of us who were able to see much of the ceremony is that of Amanda Gorman and the poet laureate, and a 22-year-old young Black woman who puts into words what my heart or my mind or my emotion feels and wants to be able to express. And it was just so beautifully performed by her as really a piece of spoken word poetry as well, that I want to mark this moment as it was women handing off to other women the baton for what the future of our country could be. And I think that is an appropriate night then for us to ground ourselves in this commitment to equity for our students within our district and making opportunities available to every single student and removing the barriers that currently exist. So I'd like to welcome Elaine back. She, I know, has a busy evening planned for us, so I'm excited for the conversation.
Great. I'm really pleased to be back again with those of you that we were able to be together. It was way back in September. So it's good to be able to reconnect and to do these kinds of things. There will be, periodic times during the presentation to kind of stop, ponder, ask questions, share insights and those kinds of things, as well as for the school board members, similar to what we did last time, is that after we go through kind of this information sharing and the initial processing, then I will offer to each of you the opportunity to connect with me, and more one-on-one we can address, individual questions and do some additional processing. So I hope those of you that were with me last time got the opportunity to do a lot of talking about race and racism and interrupting racism, and that we again revisit that these are important conversations that we have, but none of us are experts in this area. So it's really important that all of us collaborate in order to kind of make sense of what's going on. So with that, I'll kind of get started with sharing some PowerPoint. Can you all see the PowerPoint?
Not yet. We cannot.
Okay, that's not a good sign. So I thought I did share. So where did it go? Share the screen. There it is.
There we go. It's coming.
Okay.
We got it.
It just took up to a long time. So again, the topic tonight is addressing educational equity, and I did send out to you some things to kind of read ahead of time, which the Oregon Center for Educational Equity has tried to compile, because we know that getting started in talking about equity means that we've got to understand it and take it apart and take a deep dive into some of the specifics. We have to be able to talk about it so that we can embrace it in our lives and our work. And we have to know what we mean when we talk about educational equity so that we can create and sustain both structures and culture. And that's an important theme for us to think about tonight. It's not just about policies and about practices that we have in our schools. It's really about the beliefs and behaviors that all of us who make up the system have. And so the quote up here, that fair doesn't mean giving every child exactly the same thing. It means giving every child what they need. And so that has not been the ways in which we have approached education. Education was, particularly public education, started more on a factory model, that we had some ways to move kids through in batches based on birth dates about, what they were going to do. And we kind of had a one size fits all. We have gotten better at personalizing and looking at the needs of individual folks, but we really don't yet have a system and a culture that provides what each and every student needs. So we know that creating both equality and equity are essential, yet equality really can't come until we do the equity work that is so important. So equality is something that we aspire to. It's about having the same rights and status and responsibilities. It's truly having a diverse and inclusive society, which does not exist now. And we live in a time where that has been pointed out to us in a variety of different ways. And if we look at our schools, we don't yet have a place where we honor truly the diversity of each and every student that we serve. And we certainly have not included all of the members of our community and our families as effectively as we know we need to in our schools. So that means we've got to look at equity, about being fair and inclusive, treating people and helping them with both what they need with their advantages and their disadvantages. And so that's going to be another theme, where this isn't just about looking at one segment of a population. It's looking at our whole system and looking at the ways in which things need to be transformed. Because when there is privilege for some, there is oppression and barriers for others. And so that's a basic component of educational equity that we have to look at, because privilege and oppression are two sides of the same coin. And that coin is a system of inequality, where there is privilege, where there is better access, where there are more opportunities, where there is a knowledge of the system, where there are curriculum and instruction that really highlights people who look like me and have similar lived experience to me, whereas there is oppression where there has been prejudice and discrimination. There is unintended consequences where people do not get what they need in order to even understand the system to be able to move into it. So when we think about educational equity, we've got to look at privilege and oppression. And I have to be honest, when I put the mirror up to myself, I got into equity work through the lens of gender because I felt the oppression. I felt the oppression as a high school student athlete who was in GAA. And I never got to play basketball in the main basketball in the gymnasium in my high school. We played in what was called the girls' gym. And you had to put your foot up against the wall because the boundary lines went all the ways to the wall. So when you inbounded a pass, there was no place for even my parents to sit and watch me play in high school unless they stood in the doorway of the gym. So I entered as a high school student, then as a college athlete, as a woman who got hired to be the only woman in my entire district teaching high school social studies, to really feel the gender oppression. And that's what kind of inspired me to work on it. But that was not complete, because I also have a tremendous amount of privilege as a white woman. And I need to look at the systems that both privilege me and oppress me. And I need to be able to have those conversations. So when it comes to privilege, each of us needs to talk about who's being advantaged, who gets a benefit that others don't get. Where's the preference? Who are we thinking about when we're creating certain kinds of systems or certain kinds of classes? What do some people feel they are entitled to because the system has always provided that to them at the expense of other people? Who has immunity from some of the other barriers that are going on? Who's considered normal? And thereby, who's considered abnormal or not really fitting in and being included? And then when it comes to looking at oppression, what are those barriers? Where is there negative bias? Whether it's conscious or unconscious, whether that bias plays out in intentional actions or unintended actions. Where are the kinds of prejudice, the prejudging, the stereotyping? Where has discrimination been in place? And so therefore, even if we're trying to counter the discrimination, are there people that are fearful that the same old will be there? Who's been marginalized and put to the side and not considered to have a voice? How have we forced people to assimilate into a culture that is not really their culture in order to fit in? And what was lost when we told people that who they are and their families and the heritage and culture that they prize doesn't have a place in our schools? And how have we excluded folks? So when we talk about educational equity, we're really going to have to embrace talking about privilege and oppression, putting the mirror up to ourselves so that we look at ourselves, and also being willing to have those conversations with others. So as Tim Weiss said, and he's a white man who does a great deal of equity work, he says, if we really don't figure out how to create equity of opportunity and access in our schools, housing, healthcare, decent pays, we're not going to survive as a productive and healthy society. And unfortunately, we have some indications that we need to work urgently to make sure that we do have a productive and healthy society right today and right now. Also, given that this is our week that we commemorate and celebrate Martin Luther King, it's really helpful to think back to some of his words that can inspire us, because we do need to be inspired to be leaders for educational equity. And he said, we have before us the glorious opportunity to inject a new dimension of love into the veins of our civilization. And I think when we think about educators, we do love our kids. We love the work that we do. We feel we are doing valuable work, but perhaps we don't look at how to use love to make the system really work for us. The time is always right to do the right thing. And if I cannot do great things, then I can do small things in a great way, because change doesn't just roll in. It is not inevitable. There is struggle to have change. So there will be some times when we're uncomfortable with the conversations. There will be some times when conflicts will need to be addressed. There are times when we need to bring the muck up from the bottom of the pond and not pretend that things are all fine just because the surface water looks good. We need to dig in underneath to see what really is operating that may not be healthy and may be causing harm. So Bell Hooks also gives me a quote that helps me to embrace that we do this work through love. We do not do this work through shaming and blaming and judging others and somehow saying some of us have the righteous answers and others of us don't. We say that through love, we will come together and we will work together because love is an action, not just a feeling. And if we embrace love as an action, then we assume both accountability and responsibility. And for us at the Oregon Center for Educational Equity, responsibility means having the ability to respond and being accountable for when we respond and when we choose not to respond. So I come to you to say the work that we're going to talk about tonight is really about creating that collaborative culture where each of us has such a strong commitment to public education and our moral imperative to teach every student well that we do it through love. So the National Equity Project really identifies 3 critical areas of educational equity that we need to address, and it needs to be a forefront priority for us. And that is reducing the predictability of who succeeds and who fails based on identity markers, based on race, based on socioeconomic status, based on gender, based on zip code. Those kinds of things we need to start to look at, that there are patterns. And therefore, that means the system is working in ways that those patterns are alive and well. So reducing that predictability of both who succeeds and who fails so that we can look more at elevating all students on the pathway to success. Interrupting reproductive practices that perpetuate the negative kinds of environments that our vulnerable and marginalized students have been facing. And that just because it works for a large chunk of folks doesn't mean that it works well enough to meet our goal as public educators. So how is it that we look at those practices that we may not even have thought about as having those negative impacts? And then lastly, it's about embracing the unique talents and gifts. This is not about deficit thinking. This is not about being missionaries to try to rescue some poor folks who haven't been able to achieve. It's about seeing that there is human dignity and worth in each and every student and family that we serve, and we need to seek out those gifts and talents and build our structures upon that, understanding that we also need to figure out who is it that needs some of the supports because of some of the barriers. So we talked about this, I think, at the first session, but it's worth noting that empathy is at the center of what we're really talking about when we're talking about how we are going to be leaders for educational equity. And empathy is seeing with the eyes of another, listening with the ears of another, and feeling with the heart of another. But it won't just by itself combat the corrosive forces, the systemic oppression, the marginalization, the exclusion, and the hurt and harm. Whether that's intentional or not, just thinking about other people and being compassionate isn't enough, though it will give us the courage and the hope to move forward. So empathy should be that springboard for action so that we are constantly looking outside our own bubble. I know that I live in a bubble here in Albany. I know that I have lived in a white privileged bubble all of my life. And so how is it that I can grow my antenna? How is it that I can be far more aware of the lived experiences of others and use that in order to have hope that we truly can make a difference and therefore courage to take the steps to do that? So a hard thing for me over all of the years, I started teaching in 1973. So I have been in schools for a really long time, that schools need this systemic change. They are far too similar, not only to when I started my teaching career, but when I went through schools. And so when I think about my experiences in grade school in the 1950s and my experiences in secondary education in the 1960s, schools look far more similar than they do transformed. And so therefore, I think it's really important that we understand we're not really necessarily going to be able to tinker around the edges. We're going to have to really look at transforming those structures. And then, as I said before, the culture, the beliefs and the behaviors, the hearts and the minds of each and every person who works within public education. So when we talk about systemic change, we need to have equity-minded educators, and they must collaborate. This is not something that one can do by themselves. Even if you are the most gung-ho educational equity leader that there is, it cannot be accomplished as a solitary mission. It has to be collaborative. And it means that we have to be conscious, which means we have to pull back the layers of the onion to figure out what are those practices and policies, the expectations and the unspoken rules that go on, that place responsibility for whether students succeed or not on the very students for whom the system was not designed and for whom they're feeling as though they don't really fit in to begin with, rather than those of us who are taking a paycheck or have volunteered to do work in the public education sphere, to take it on as our individual and institutional responsibility to remedy the marginalization. So it's to the point where we can no longer ignore it, and we certainly can't blame the students and families for the situations that we haven't done everything that we can do to change the structures and culture. So a wonderful mentor of mine really coached me to say, Elaine, before you ask, what will I do? I must first determine who will I be? Because nobody can give me the top 10 list of what to do to change public schools if I haven't embraced what it means for me to be that kind of advocate, to be that kind of change agent, to move forward. So a lot of the work that we do at the Oregon Center for Educational Equity, we call inside out work. First, it's about ourselves and really getting in touch with some of the beliefs and behaviors that we have that both help and hinder us from moving forward as equity leaders. And then we can collaborate on what we're going to do. But first, it's really about, have I committed that this is a priority and it is something that I am going to address in every way? So I have to be ready for the pushback when people say, didn't we do equity last year? Isn't that a topic we've already done enough on? Let's move on to something else. Or when somebody says, you know, I don't see any difference between students. I treat students all the same. Everything's fine. I succeeded in school. If they work hard, they can succeed too. So I've got to be ready as who I am to be able to say that equity is a priority that cuts across everything. It is not an agenda item nor a specific topic. It is a way of being. And for me, when I chose to be in public education, and I was raised in an affluent, privileged family where I attended both public schools and private schools, but I knew that I wanted to work in public education because I believe that public educations will change the future, will make our communities better. And that's who I am, and that's how I have to be before I ever get my list of to-dos. So I encourage you to think about, you know, how prepared are you to address folks who say, well, equity is one of many priorities. No, equity is a lens through which you look at all of your priorities, because in public education, our mission is to serve each and every student well. So equity-minded educators have to call attention to the patterns of inequity. It's not fun to look your colleagues in the eyes or to confess your own shortcomings when there are patterns that you have participated in that have caused inequities in the student outcomes. And we can't go back, but we can go forward and make some differences. Equity-minded educators are willing to take both personal and institutional responsibility. That means carving out from our precious time, little time that we have to collaborate with each other to say, we're responsible if even one student is not feeling safe in our schools, if even one student is not feeling like they can attend because this is not a place for them. We have to take on that critical analysis of our practices and be willing to say, yes, I'm going to look at myself. I'm going to look at what we are doing, and we're going to unpack what are the contributing factors to what's going on. And then, as we talked about the last time, the Oregon Center for Educational Equity does advocate that we look at race first. Not that there's an oppression Olympics where certain kinds of forms of oppression are more important than others, but if we take on race and really look at it deeply, I think we will learn how to take on the other identity markers that may cause prejudice, discrimination, exclusion, marginalization, and lack of the ability to achieve success in schools. So being race conscious, which includes understanding the social and historical context of the exclusionary practices, understanding why some of our parents of color will not gleefully come into the school setting to talk with teachers and administrators based on the experiences they had when they were in school. And as a white woman, I have to know that when I was dealing with parents and those kinds of things, it could be traumatizing and bringing up all sorts of experiences, negative experiences that they had with white women who looked like me, because white women are a great many of us who are in public education. So I have to be aware of that and not to be defensive and not take it personally, because as an equity-minded educator, I'm going to be race conscious, and then I'm going to move on and be gender conscious and sexual orientation conscious and ability conscious and socioeconomic conscious and all of those kinds of things, whether it's in my lived experiences or not. And so it's also important to talk about creating an environment that embraces the underlying assumption that it is a right for every learner to be in public education, and that some of our students don't always come as compliant folks, and we're going to have to figure out what is it that we need to do to be able to help them realize that right, so that habitually, that means every day in every way, we're enhancing the resources and the supports that students need, so that it really is about every learner. Not about what works for most learners, but what works for every learner. And that's an awesome, overwhelming task to take, but that has to be our mission and it has to be our aspiration. So when we have spent some time with groups of teachers and administrators, community members, and students about what do equity-minded educators really need to do, it is about that personal and institutional responsibility. The consciousness and the awareness of the current and the historical context of what's going on. There is a legacy that continues on that many families feel deeply today, and others are totally unaware of what's going on. That we have to be willing to critically assess and acknowledge that our practices may not be working. It's great to celebrate that we're doing a good job, but as educators, as learners ourselves, we have to critically acknowledge that there are practices that aren't working, that we don't even know why we do those practices. And so if we are continuing on some of the traditions that have gone on and we don't know why we're doing them, then we probably need to pause and look at them. We have to understand that inequities are a dysfunction of the structures, policies, and practices, and that just changing the policy or the practice isn't going to automatically change things. But if our policies and practices are not explicit about prioritizing equity and inclusion and diversity, then we really don't have anything that pushes us to look at it. We need to question the assumptions, recognize stereotypes that harm students and negatively impact their success. And the best teachers are those students and their families who we need to build trust with so that they will share with us, because it's very difficult to figure out what's going on for students when your own personal and professional lived experiences are so different than the students for whom we're trying to make some difference. And then it's a constant commitment to reassessing our beliefs, our behaviors, our practices, our policies. It's never done. It's a journey. It's something that we are constantly needing to revisit because we are dealing with humans. The human dynamics business means that there's lots and lots of different spikes to the circle that we're trying to work on. So those are important things, as well as when you read through the article, and I won't go into great detail, there are some commitments that folks need to make. And that is that they are committed to equity and doing something about it, to sustaining a culture of inclusion. And that means authentic inclusion. You know, it's often interesting when schools talk about how warm and welcoming we are and that, you know, we're just one big family and everything's great. And then you hear stories about the students and the families who don't feel included, but somehow we're not willing to tell the story that we aspire to be warm and welcoming and inclusive. And we know that there are some folks who don't feel welcome or don't feel included or don't feel that they fit for any variety of reasons. We need in the 21st century to truly honor diversity, to see that as an asset, to not be falling into the trap that diversity causes problems. One of the things that all of our students, but particularly my children and my grandchildren who are white, dominant culture, privileged kids, they need to understand the world in which they live, which is diverse. And that when I don't talk about it with them, then I don't prepare them for their futures. So it's not just about kids of color or poor kids or English language learners and those things. Every student needs to be able to honor diversity and move in a global society where not everyone sees the world the same way as you do, and not everyone has the same experiences. We talked about not doing deficit thinking, but instead asset orientation, empathy, cultural humility, knowing that I don't know a whole lot about my own culture, let alone about other people's cultural experiences. So how can I be humbly curious and eager to learn more, not only about how my culture influences me, but how multiple cultures are influencing all of us, and how is it that we thrive with each other. Student-centeredness. For many years, I would say the entire time that I have been in education, that has been an aspiration to move away from adult-centered schools to student-centered schools, but we're not there yet. We really aren't necessarily looking at what's in the best interest of students and how is it that the adults shift and change instead of having kids shift and change. Trusting relationships. If we can't develop relationships, it's going to be very difficult for us to have multiple perspectives shared and to be able to have the multicultural and multiracial dynamics of collaboration that are needed. We're not just in the academic business, so social and emotional intelligence is important as well. And then finally, multiple pathways and bridges to success. There is not one way to be successful in this country and in this world, and so schools can't have a single pathway in order to be successful. So we're getting to a time where think about, what you want to share. I wanted to talk about the essential questions that I will ask you as an equity leader. I want each of us to ask, who am I in relationship to the students and the families I serve, in the skin that I'm in? So for me, as a white woman, as a 69-year-old white woman, who am I in relationship with the students I serve? What role do I play? And it should probably say roles do I play, because I have the formalized roles, but I also have the spheres of influence that I get to have contact throughout my community in order to make a difference. What experiences have I had, and what experiences haven't I had? What are my fears about what I don't know, and how willing am I to admit when I don't know something? Can I enter into this being vulnerable and therefore seeking feedback from others when I've made mistakes or when I've missed the mark? Can I be responsible, which means being accountable to respond and also accountable if I choose not to respond, and have that cultural humility? So equity leadership gives us some dilemmas. We can go here, we can go there. We've got a variety of ways that we've got to negotiate. We've got this notion that to achieve equity, we've got to have some leaders who are willing to transform what's going on, look at success, make some kinds of changes. I love the quote at the bottom. Those who practice leadership for equity must confront, disappoint, and dismantle, as well as energize, inspire, and empower. So we've got both looking at what's not working, taking it apart. This is not easy because we are taking it apart while we're also trying to have the system work. We don't get to take, a couple of years off to say, let's not do education and take it apart. So at the same time that we're confronting it, we're disappointing some people because we're changing it and they felt very comfortable with what the system was, even to the point of being entitled to what the system was, dismantling it so that we energize, inspire, and empower and create something new. So our challenge is to meet the academic, social, and emotional needs. They come to us with different set of values, beliefs, socioeconomic experiences, behaviors, their view of what's work, home language, degrees of ableness. And I have to say this, that I have to continue to remind myself. Interesting that our most challenging issues involve student populations that just so happen to experience life different from most of us who are responsible for the instruction. So there is this gap between those of us who are running the system, who are the teachers and the administrators, the classified staff, the bus drivers, all sorts of folks, and the life experience of the students for whom the system really isn't working. So Paul Gorski, another educational leader, asked us, are we ready for that shift? That honoring diversity, yeah, helps, but we've got to go much beyond that. So the key question for him and a key question for us tonight and as we move forward is whether every student who walks in our schools has an opportunity to achieve to his and her fullest, to have access to an equitable, validating, supportive learning environment, regardless of any dimensions of identity or any lived experiences. Because public education is for that common good. It is about fostering social cohesion, increasing diverse society, Public schools must serve all children, not simply those with the loudest and most powerful advocates. And that's tough. We have folks in our community who understand the system, who can advocate very well for their kids, who actually have kids who are thriving and doing very well in our system. But we also have folks that we need to be their advocates because they don't understand the system. They don't come to us readily to let us know what's going on. And they too deserve to be served well. So let's take a moment to kind of talk about what's coming up for you when you think about educational equity, and stop Elaine from just talking. So what about the common good? What is it that you are thinking about? I think I have a slide back here that will help us. I don't seem to find it. Okay.
I just wanted to pipe in and say, so we can't see everyone on the screen while Elaine is showing.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. I was going to say, so while she's showing it, if you guys want to use board book to raise your hands, I'll call on people that way. That way she can still show her slideshow if needed.
So what's coming up for you when you think about leading for educational equity, how you confront issues, how the district confronts issues? What questions and concerns about seeing equity as a mindset comes up for you?
I'm not sure I have a lot of, well, I mean, I guess I probably have lots of questions and concerns, but not so much as just the feeling of a little bit of overwhelmed, I guess is how I would feel about my desire to want to get to that good place and it taking a while to get there, and what happens in between, which I think you talked about a little bit when you said we have to do the here and now, address things that are going on while we're trying to move things forward. And I think it's exciting and it's a wonderful opportunity. It's just it feels overwhelming because I want to already sort of be there, or being able to get others to be there, and it can be a lot of work to get others to get there, myself included.
Kim, I think that's a really important thing to share about that feeling of overwhelm. So what we'll go to in a couple of minutes is, so what's a slice of the pie that we're going to take on first?
Right.
And how is it that we learn from whatever it is that we take on more specifically, instead of continuing to talk about everything and more in a global sense? So where are we going to focus? Where is a need? Where is something that we will take on so that we learn how to make some of those judgments?
Yeah.
Others, anything else that people are thinking about?
I think Director Roach, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Elaine. I'm Justin Roach. I'm
Hi,
new to
Justin.
the board. I just joined a couple, I don't know, a month and a half ago.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I taught for 11 years in the district and did 3 years as a behavior specialist, and now focus on recruitment and retention of teachers, particularly diverse candidates. So this is kind of my world, and I'm excited about this work. I think from a personal standpoint, I've thought a lot about this, particularly since May and George Floyd's murder, about my role as a straight white male, someone who has extreme privilege, and about hearing those places where I can take up less space as someone who has quite a lot of privilege and a platform for to speak and opportunities to speak that many don't. But now that I'm in a leadership position, it's different, right? And I feel like I have to have courage now to say the things that that need to be said and need to be pushed. And I want to, that's one of the things I've really noticed about our district leadership, has had that courage to really continually say these things and try to change that culture. And I think that's been tough for our community. And I've really noted that since I came on the board, that it's been rubbing folks the wrong way in some ways because of the speed in which I know that Melissa and Lisa want to go and that I want to go. And I think most of us want to be there, as Kim was talking about. So those are the sort of the things we're wrestling with, is how to have this conversation and bring people along, but also noticing, there's as Melissa mentioned, the poet laureate this morning. It was incredible. She had a line about the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And that we have children in our district who are experiencing injustice every day. And that we can't wait for that kid to be stuck calling an N-word, or we can't wait for that parent who's working 3 jobs to, get the resources to their student that we would expect in a fair society, right? So those are the things that I'm kind of wrestling with, is sort of the pacing and how do we move that culture along and support the district leadership to do this work.
Yeah, a couple of things kind of hit me with that. It was a topic that we talked about that you weren't with us, that if we can't talk about some of these things, we have little chance of being able to collaborate to really do things. So talking is important. It is not the answer, but it is on the pathway to working. And that, yes, those of us who have privilege and those kinds of things have different forums, so we can talk in those spheres of influence. But it's also important to create space for others to talk, who can really talk from their lived experiences. And so part of the work of an educational equity leader is to really open up the dialogue. And that, again, won't happen if we can't develop trusting relationships with people across diversity and people who share different perspectives in our town. So we've got to be willing to have those tough conversations, whether it's on the soccer field or whether it's at the family dinner or whether it's at, a board meeting or at a community event, because unless we can unearth what really are the priorities, we're not going to build the coalitions that we need in order to make those kinds of changes. So you're absolutely right that there's this hesitancy to dominate and to talk from a privileged perspective because I don't know, I haven't experienced those kinds of things, but then it's also to use that privilege to be able to open up the forums and create spaces for others to share who don't have easy access to the institutions that we run. Great.
I would share a few things. I think, for me, I want to work in a system where I know that each one of our kids gets what they need to become who they were meant to become. And so I think I try to really elevate the experience and voices of students, because I think we learn as much from them as they do from us. And part of that this year, I've been so excited about our student board members and their willingness to share their perspective and their voice, because I think it's really important in the conversations. And I think as a leader, it is hard because leading means that you're out in front, and sometimes that can be lonely and you're alone. And sometimes I think, I look at our systems and I know for a fact that any procedure that we have that requires a student to have an advocate will be inequitable, because we have students that through no fault of their own don't have an advocate. And so my job is to make sure that all of those systems honor, protect, and serve all of our students, regardless if they have an advocate or not. And I know in changing those, folks that held traditionally positions of influence or power are very hesitant, and I would say, opposed to those systems changing because they've enjoyed a level of influence that they would like to continue to enjoy. That is hard. And I will tell you that making other adults uncomfortable, while not my goal, doesn't bother me because I never went into this business to please adults to begin with.
That's great.
Right? Like
Yeah.
I came into this to serve children. And at the end of the day, if I can go to bed knowing I did my very best to do that, I'll be just fine.
And I think you said something that also is really important for us to take on an equity lens, that you want each student to be who they were meant to be, which also means that we need to open up options and opportunities that they didn't even know existed if we in public education did not provide the new eyes and the new vistas for folks to look at. So, that's why it really is, where's my heart in this work, and how is it that I can create a culture in the Greater Albany School District where our hearts are so full with the priority of that truly student-centeredness, that we are, and using what we have always said about public education, that is your stepping stone to success, but now broadening our understanding of what that means. Anybody else?
Go ahead, Jen.
Okay, thanks. I'll just hop in here. So to what Kim and Lisa both said about, well, one, I agree with how enlightening and refreshing and different our student school board member reports have been this year. And if we're looking for a place, especially as a board, we have influence at a high level in the, kind of at the 300-foot level in the district. It's hard for me to see places where we can implement some of these things that we're talking about in a very tangible way. But I think that's one place that we can. And, a great reason that, we just have super school board reporters, or student school board members, but we always have. I've always been impressed with the caliber of the students that take an immense amount of time to serve with us on the board. But because we've had a different environment this year, our students used to report on activities, and that was great. There was great insight into what was going on in our schools. Well, we're not in our schools. Our students aren't in our schools. And we, our teachers aren't walking the hallways and hearing the tea, as my teenager puts it, about what's going on, right? So our student school board members have been giving us the tea, and here's what's happening with our students. Here's what they think. Here's what they're experiencing on these issues that impact them. And what I would hope is that as a board, that is something that we could keep and that we could implement even when we are back in our schools.
I want to tag on that too, because I think that it is a platform. And when we're talking about creating platforms, it's a platform that's been there, but maybe hasn't necessarily been utilized in the way that it should be. And I think part of it is us, determining what does that role look like for future, student participants. And I think that they've done, like you said, all of them have always done an outstanding job and have been a big piece of it. I think that this year has given them the opportunity, and they've both taken the responsibility to actually get out and ask students the questions and help provide the platform for those other students to speak. And then they become the voice for them, but maybe we can utilize that even better. And I love the fact that they both do that. They reach out, they get feedback from other students, they become that voice of those other students in sharing with us. And it's become a really strong platform for us to hear from students. But again, a platform that can continue to expand and grow if we can provide it in other ways. You know, as an example, we don't have a representative from AOS, but I would love to hear the same types of things from those students. And when we don't have a representative, how can we get that platform opened up to them in a way that they feel comfortable also sharing? And so I think there's opportunities for us to continue to expand on that, and we're seeing the benefits of having it for sure.
That's great. So thinking about the two-way communication between the board and the students, as well as multiple ways for students to have that kind of input. That sounds great. That's good. Anyone else?
One of the things that I think about, and I think about it in terms of my work all the time, as a white woman who's been in a superintendency now, I think this is my 6th year as a superintendent, is around the equity of access to power and influence. And whose voice am I hearing? And what pre-existing conditions make that possible for me to hear their voice? And therefore, whose voices then am I missing? And what conditions do I need to put in place in order to then hear those voices? Because the way the design is built is that I hear the voices I'm hearing. And it is a constancy in my mind, in my brain. It's why we started the Parents of Black Students meeting that I hold, and definitely informs and changes my practice. It's why I meet with our Spanish speaking families, definitely informs and changes my practice. I think there are so many, and it's like this in every school district that I've worked in. There are people who have a great amount of power and influence within the system. And typically it's areas of the community. It's typically long-standing folks. So it's not only zip code, but it is also longevity. We've been here forever. And just that statement alone, that one statement, think of what is packed in that one statement, right? We've been here forever. And and it has not, I've never heard that. I have never heard that from a Native family. So that statement has always been from a white family when I've heard it. And I'm not attributing that to any conversations that I've had here in GAPS even. I'm using it as an example of this very predictable power and influence that happens within any school district community, and is a sign of oppression within the system that is built by the superintendent, the executive leadership, and the school board, in that there is not active enough effort to then seek out those voices whose influence needs to be sought out in a different way, because the path we've built is not one they can access.
I think it's always wise for us to take a moment in any time we use the word we, about who is the we, because in reality, we as a community of Albany are a subset of many micro communities, some of which interact with each other, others do not, except in the schoolhouse. And so public schools are the only real places in a community where all micro communities have to come together and have to work with each other So when we don't unpack, when folks say, we've been here for a long time, we know that the system works, who's the we and who isn't included in that we? And that's where we'll talk about a little bit using that equity lens. How do you take an equity pause when you're talking about things to just ponder things like that? Who's the we? Who's in? Who's out? Who's benefiting? Who's being harmed? Who's not even being considered when we're looking at doing something? So I think to me, that's where, it really is about how do I have this mindset that it's too easy for us to perpetuate what we've always had and to celebrate what we perceive as working for the we that we have prioritized in the past, which is not an inclusive we. Okay, we're going to move on a little bit because I did say that, one of the things I'm going to
Really
advocate,
quick.
you start to look at
It's okay.
specifics. So if there are people who want to talk, now's the time.
I think Michael had a
Well,
comment.
Melissa kind of stole what I was going to say, kind of, going back to, I've just found it helpful going back to when we did the strategic plan like a year and a half ago. We started, our just community discussions around that. We started asking different communities that get, even beyond school, that get involved in community activities in general. And it's helped me when I talk to mostly white parents to reference back to these stories and experiences I've heard, thanks to the district kind of reaching out and getting those experiences. So I'm suggesting that to all our board members that, taking the time to listen to those different voices helps the discussion. It's not me telling you, or it's not just me telling you as a board member, it's look at these parents, and it's pretty hard to deny the lived experience of another parent. It's kind of, you have to be pretty awful to deny that. So that's been a positive, and I've used that a lot to try to help with this discussion.
And I think I'm always floored to find out how many people go, that really happens? Like when I have had those conversations with people, no, they couldn't have said that in school. They couldn't have called somebody that. Kids don't really do that. Oh, yes, they do. I mean, and so it's those experiences that we can share, without getting into specifics. Obviously, we don't talk about specifics, but any of those things that we can share about things that really are happening in our schools, in our district. It's interesting to me to watch people kind of have a different reaction to it and go, oh, well, now I kind of get why you would want to do this. I kind of understand now why you might want to change the school mascot for the high school. It took a lot of sharing of those stories like Michael was talking about, and those experiences that other people have come across to get others in the community to really understand. The biggest challenge is there's 5 of us or 10 of us collectively, right? In a community so large. And, we each have our circles and places that we can have those conversations. And sometimes, and this is where I'm hoping to get to at some point, is how do we reach the other areas that aren't within our circles? Because those are easy for us to do on a regular basis, but those are probably not the people that always need to hear it. And getting outside of our normal circle, and that's uncomfortable too, right? So eventually getting to that point, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I think that's why we have to have all of the adults within the system a part. We can't just siphon it off to the school board or just to administrators or those kinds of things. It really needs to be a priority that is pervasive throughout all we do in what's going on. And so, when we are in schools, we do have contact with our families and our students and those kinds of things. But when we don't engage in those conversations, we don't develop those kinds of relational trust. So therefore we can't really collaborate with them. So yeah, that's important. Okay. Can you see my Let's see if I can make it work. Okay. So we're to the point of where we need to kind of put some of the puzzle pieces together. And as you know, Kim said, feeling overwhelmed. How is it that we take on, certain things to change people and therefore the systems? What do you focus on? What are some of the ways to think and to act? And so I gave you kind of a sheet that outlined some of the key points that were in the article. One of the things, and we won't go into this activity unless someone has something that they really do want to share, it is to be able to have some of those talking points, so that when you do have the opportunity to talk about equity, when you start talking about, one of the things for me is that it's point number 15 on this: multicultural and social justice, cultural responsiveness is essential for dominant culture students as well as continuing to work with our students who have been marginalized and not served well. That this is good teaching that we're talking about when we're talking about equity, that being able to have multiple pathways for folks, opening up opportunities, not fixing students so that they fit into one kind of shoebox. If everybody had to wear the same shoes, lots of us would have feet that hurt because we don't fit exactly the same kinds of things. So the other thing is that educational equity can't be reactive, where we're just responding to what we hear as incidents and those kinds of things. It's got to be proactive. We have enough stories to know where we need to be doing some of the work. So, how is it that we get ahead of the curve as opposed to just, kind of waiting until something blows up and moves ahead? And then some of the work on data, that data will not tell the whole story. And that sometimes, we look at our data and we celebrate some, minor improvements, or we, kind of loathe what's going on, but we don't get at what's really causing the data. So I think that's where it is, looking at the patterns and the symptoms and the lived experiences of students and really questioning what it is that we are doing in order to move forward. Is there anything that folks came up with that they wanted to highlight?
I was thinking a lot about data, and I've mentioned to Melissa an interest in, having schools look more at the behavior data that they get. And so I think you're right that data can be deceiving. It can lead you down some rabbit holes, but it can also start conversations. And so if we're able to encourage, folks to start looking at why is it that, our school has 10%, Latino students, but 40 some percent of the major behavior referrals are that. Those are questions that start leading to looking at what is the story there.
Right. And I think the key that you said is why.
Right.
So
right.
it's
And
not just looking
at
the data, and as much as No Child Left Behind, has not always been seen as always positive. That was the first time that we had to disaggregate that data and look at it. And that's when many of us said, oh my goodness, it's worse than I thought it was. So you're absolutely right. I'm not saying don't look at data, but don't just stop at the data. Ask those why questions and go more deeply. Great, thanks.
I think along with data, you can also very easily count successes and then stop. You see that a lot where you have a small goal and you go, oh, hey, we just need to reach this number to be successful or more successful. And then you reach that number, and it is a celebration. Don't get me wrong. It's always a celebration to reach those goals. But then people stop, or they don't take the next step, or they don't take a different lens and start working on a different aspect or a different piece of it. And so I think some of it is just, how do you create a plan of action or a process or things? And I get that it's a lot of the behavior piece of it, but when you start narrowing it down to where can we start? What are we going to focus on? Can we use that data to make a difference and go there? But getting that continued system in place so others coming behind us can also, you know, keep it going. It's like with everything else. You start something, you get partway through, you think you're being successful, life throws you a curveball, COVID, and now you focus over here because it's the priority work, and then this stuff tends to get put behind again, and then you're that much further behind, and it's making it a part of, like I think you said earlier, just the everyday philosophy, no matter what we're doing, what gets thrown at us, that it stays in the forefront, and someone at some point, some group of adults or whatever we're looking at this being in our case, need to build the foundation. And I think that's where we're at. And then trying to build a foundation that's sustainable and continues to grow. And I, you know, I feel like we have a lot of work to do to build that foundation and keep things moving. But I'm also looking forward to where others can continue to take it after. We may or may not still be here, and even how we can continue to be part of that if we're here or not here. And I think for me, I noticed the biggest struggles were kind of how to, I can't remember which one it was, getting others to kind of do the buy-in without it being, I think it said something about blame and shaming people or whatever. And that's important because I feel like that's how people feel. I'm getting a sense of people from different areas of our community where it's one, not having a good understanding of the equity work, but then also feeling like it means they're losing in some capacity, or that we're blaming them, or we're shaming people, and how we can get that to change so that people don't feel like this is a negative thing.
That because we're doing this, it means others are going to suffer, that there's always going to be that hurt and harm, instead of saying, no, we're trying to create systems where there is not hurt and harm, that what students need is what they get, and that we don't overdo towards those who have been successful, and we don't underdo towards those who have not been.
And I think the hardest thing for me right now is just nationally and worldwide. I mean, we're seeing this as a political issue. We're seeing this in all aspects, to where it's being even more divisive.
Right.
And that's making this work, I think, even more challenging right now, for sure.
So I picked up on the data. I think that data statement was the only one that I circled, just because, as you know, I like data. But I think, as Justin said, in this context, it serves us as a starting point, and it helps us know where we should ask those additional questions of why. Almost all of these statements I underlined, but there were two that I hearted as well. One of them was, there is a real danger in the culture of low expectations. I love thinking about the possibility of having high expectations for all of our students, and knowing that they're not in vain, because the supports or the pathways or the help that each student needs is accessible to them, so they can actually reach those high expectations. And then, just as we've already discussed, that equity work needs to focus on assets, not deficits. That just appeals to me. I tend to be an optimist anyway, and I like the idea of looking at this from a positive standpoint, and from looking at our ability to build on what each student brings to the classroom, because every student does.
Great. So the puzzle pieces that we're finding helpful for folks to look at is to get beyond just looking at the achievement gap and starting to unpack and to focus on some of these other areas. Yes, the achievement gap, some of the data that we can look at, and that starts us to then look at the opportunity gap. You know, where is it that students have, both within and outside school, opportunities that help or hinder being able to move forward to be successful? How are resources and some of the structures that we have creating opportunity and limiting opportunity? Related to that then is that access gap about, you know, what are the policies and practices that really make it far more difficult for some students to take advantage of programs that are helping some students to succeed? Where are some of the traditions, norms, and expectations about who should be involved? You talked about how great it is to have, you know, student representatives on the school board. But when people think about being a student representative on the school board, what type of student would consider doing that? What are the ways in which we've cultivated that a variety of students could have a very useful voice? Why only one and not a collaborative group that would perhaps represent more of a student voice? Is there an age discrimination that goes on, that high school students have traditionally held that spot, but we haven't opened up, you know, opportunities for younger students to feel like they too could speak to the school board? So some of those access kinds of things can really open up some of the conversations. And certainly Justin talked about the behavior management gap, the ways in which that we have some data about how folks are being handled, but also what does it mean to be a quiet and compliant student? And what are some of the conditions that affect students' lives before they ever walk through that door or turn on that computer, and those kinds of things that we should be aware of, and therefore not punishing, but supporting students who are going through some challenging times. And quiet compliance should not be just what we're looking for. We should have eager and challenging students who are critical thinkers that go on. And sometimes that is more difficult to manage by the adult that is there, but that doesn't mean it isn't worthy of us to look at as part of our educational environment. The teaching gap, what are those expectations that teachers have of their students? What about tracking and ability grouping and this notion that you know, there are certain students that we use the phrase instructionally impaired. They never got the chance to learn this. It's not that they couldn't learn it. It's because of some of the priorities that we made or some of the ways that we structured what was going on. They didn't have the opportunity. Then we moved them along to an upper grade and they have a deficit, but they never got the chance to learn it, or they didn't get the chance to learn it in such a way that made sense to them, or had just enough baseline information so they could continue to be learners. We tend to have an all or nothing view about what's going on, and that leads towards that learning gap. What is it that the student has actually learned, and how do we know what they have actually learned? What is it that goes on, particularly those students who are attending every day and still not learning what we are hoping that they're learning, and how are we re-envisioning the teaching processes to deal with that learning gap? And then one that certainly hits a great deal when we're looking at high school graduation and those kinds of things, and that's the grading gap. And whether or not what we're really doing is reinforcing through some kind of numerical system what kids already know before they come to us, or how compliant they are with doing assignments, as opposed to, in this real time, what do they know? Now, maybe they didn't know it for the first 6 weeks. And, you know, some of those assessments showed us where they still need more coaching and more teaching and more help. But if they finally got it at the end, why are we averaging what they didn't know in the beginning with what it is that is at the end? And therefore, we have students who we're pushing out. They're not dropping out of high school. They're being pushed out because there is no chance within the system that we have created for them to make up the points that they need to get the passing grade or the baseline knowledge that they really need in order to meet graduation requirements. And then a very important one for me, and one that I think we miss the mark because we don't really talk about, and that's the worthiness gap. How do our students feel about school? Do they really feel like this is a place for them where they are truly seen, valued for who they are, that they have adults who care about them and want them to be successful? Or do they perceive that the interactions that they have with adults are really very punitive or not understanding of who they are? So when we have a worthiness gap where they feel that they're stupid, they feel that they don't fit in, and those kinds of things, then we know that continues to happen for them. So how is it that, you know, in our conversations, in our schools, in our looking at some of our data and in looking what's going on, could we take on grading? Could we take on behavior management? Could we take on access? Who is it that takes advantage of the programs that we have? Where is it that we could provide additional kinds of access for our folks? And then the other area is, you know, what are some of our mindsets? And that's what comes up with these forms of inequity. You know, when we have societal inequity, you know, how is that really living out in our community? What are those divisive conversations that Kim was talking about that we know is going on right now? And how does that influence what's going on in our schools? Are our teachers afraid to talk about certain things? I unfortunately have a 6th grade granddaughter, and she does not attend this school district, but we were talking about this week with Martin Luther King celebration and a new president coming in. She's a 6th grader with an on and off week. This was the week for social studies. So, you know, what are you talking about when it comes to race relations and the president? She said, we can't talk about that in school because that's politics. So my 6th grader in social studies classes is feeling like, who is the president of her country and the democratic processes that are going on, whether they're flawed and not working well or not, that doesn't get discussed in school. And I don't know if that's what her teacher said, but that's the impression that my 6th grade granddaughter got this week, is that we don't talk about race and we don't talk about the president being elected or a new president or a change in power or any of the things that have gone on in current events, because that's politics. So I think we've got lots of work to do to bring up some of these things, to be able to talk about socioeconomics, cultural, familial kinds of things. We talked about if kids don't have advocates, then public schools have to be able to come up with advocates for kids. That's part of our mission. And yes, we take on a lot in public education, but that's important too. Staffing is important. Do we have the use of seniority or the use of, you know, what are the good schools to teach at, and do we have turnover in some of our schools where we have some kids who really deserve to have some veteran teachers who really have some experience that are going on with what's going on? Do we have some programs that maybe at one time met the needs of a large variety of students, but don't now? So I hope that by looking at the ways in which we've tried to slice up this puzzle, you at least can jump into something that has a little bit more specifics and say, what would it be like if a group of adults at a school or across the district with parents and with kids and stuff started to take on, you know, what are the things that we can do much better in any of these areas? What came up for you when you thought about the gaps and the forms of inequities?
The first question is it possible for us to change our school district name from Greater Albany Public Schools to maybe Albany Public Schools? Sounds a little better. I've always hated the term achievement gap because I think it puts the onus on the student, and instead of the decision makers, policy makers. So I've always appreciated opportunity and access gaps, that looking at that those students haven't been provided the access and opportunity for success. And that's our responsibility as policymakers or teachers or administrators. So I always appreciated that. So the achievement gap is, that was something I think, back when people started realizing that particular groups of students were not showing the same academic achievement that others were. It was sort of, I think some of the pressure was put on those groups rather than on the policymakers to fix it.
I also think as leaders, we need to advocate for better ways to assess the academic learning of our students, because one of the stories that I tell is I was working with a young teacher who had been assigned to work with English language learners who were not doing well on the reading assessment, and they were just being drilled over and over again on how to read a passage and answer questions. And the passage that they were reading this one day when I was there was about camping and having s'mores. And no student in that group had ever seen a s'more, knew what a s'more was. It was not a reading issue. It was an experiential issue. And that test that had the camping and s'mores question was not appropriate for those students to be tested on their reading. So we need to advocate too about what are the means that we are complicit in using in the system so that we change even the broader systems beyond our own school district.
Just as you walked around the wheel there, Elaine, I really, it just struck me that in so many of those areas, as we discuss board policy, as we discuss budget, as we discuss bargaining, all of those are the major work of the board. And there are aspects with that in each of those three topics that kind of cross-cut across all of these opportunity gaps and these opportunities for us to do something different. And I think the board is at this very interesting time where budgets are going to, because of COVID and the interruption to how we've been budgeting, there is an opportunity to look at budgeting that is different in this moment. And so how will we take advantage of that opportunity, and what is the value that the board wants to place then on our budgeting processes? We are undertaking with the Oregon School Boards Association right now, just started this month, about an 18-month process to redo all our board policies. So everything having to do with students and staff, those are our first two sections we're doing. It's going to take the next 6 months, and everything that matters is going to come before the board right now. And the board gets the opportunity then to shape those pieces. And then bargaining, we actually are about to go into bargaining with both of our bargaining units. But certainly much of what you talked about is addressed through that as well. And so I think earlier, as you were walking through information for us, I think maybe some of the board members may have struggled a bit with, well, where do we hang our hat? Where does it actually fit our work? Because we're not the operational people, we're up here in policy and budget. And those are the places, and there's really some great meaty opportunities coming before the board.
Anything else? Okay, we'll jump a little bit. One of the things I wanted to bring up is that with the pandemic, there are truly some gifts that can come to us that perhaps the rules that we have always played by for decades now are no longer in place, and so need not be returned. I fear, however, when I hear folks talking about can hardly wait till we get back to normal and get back to doing things the way we have always done things, so that how is it that we seize this opportunity to maybe put that equity lens in place and do some powerful things. This is one school that said they're not going to go back to the outdated learning environments that they had before. We'll not go back to one size fits all, where the adults own the learning process. Accepting the comfort level of the status quo without having some of those tough conversations. To have complacency about addressing our equity gaps. Instead, equity is going to be elevated, and that we're not going to rob our students of being prepared for and adaptable for the ever-changing world. Because if there's one thing we learned this last year, is that everybody needs to be flexible and adaptable to what's going on. So how is it that we take on some of the powerful things that we're learning right now and be able to move forward, take this as an opportunity to make some of those equitable changes that are going on. And then how is it that we use the lens of equity, that we really do take on, that we can't solve this alone, so we have to be in partners about students need healthy food and secure home life. And though it is something that is an additional responsibility for us in public schools, we need to know how to partner throughout our community to do that. That safe, secure, and truly inclusive schools where they're valued needs to be on there, those social and emotional supports. So how is it that we're really helping folks to identify more of the issues around equity with the pandemic that are coming up? How is it that it's not just for now, but that internet access and being able to have reliable home broadband is something that we need to be advocating throughout the entire community, and that the school year needs to be looked at. So there are, big things to think about, that this is a prime opportunity. When the world is all shook up around schools, how is it that we not just revert to comfort and say, okay, when we open up schools, yeah, we're going to have a hybrid, but it's going to be a hybrid of what we did before, as opposed to where we need to go in the future. This is a prime opportunity for us to make some differences. It's also an opportunity for us to think to our future, and again, pushing a little bit on looking at race first, that since 2018, the United States population of children 10 and under has been majority non-white. And that will continue, particularly since 1/5 of the people who claim to be white dominant culture are over the age of 65. So when we start looking at the diversity of the students, in this one, the darker areas in our state that are areas that are gaining in populations of non-white students, we need to be prepared that our student populations look very different, but our staffing populations don't. And so this is data that came out of 2016-17, but it really hasn't changed a great deal since then about the percentage of students in Oregon and the staff that we employ in Oregon. And then back in 2013, TSBC did a very interesting study that said that about half of the educators of color who had teaching credentials were not currently employed. So this notion about recruiting and retaining a diverse teaching staff, there are some communities that folks of color honestly do not feel safe to teach, that they have not been welcomed. I have stories about our community and Corvallis and our surrounding community. So this is not something that we can point the fingers at other folks about what is it like to come in when 90+% of your teaching staff is white and you are the one and only, or a very small percentage of people who comes from a different perspective and maybe does not feel included, and those kinds of things. So I think it's very important that we not only look at where we are, but where we are going, and that if we do not change the culture and structures in our schools, we will not get a diverse teaching staff, and the folks who come to our community will not stay. And that will be a disservice to all of our students if we can't start to have people who look different, have different lived experiences, can truly live out a multicultural environment in our schools. The other thing that Zarita Hammond talks about is that, and this is where the school board can really look at, what is it that we are advocating? Do we advocate for a multicultural education? So when we have new materials that are purchased, are they really expanding the curriculum so that different points of view, different curriculum is going on? Do we have a social justice point of view? Do we have school board policy that says we encourage the critical consideration of controversial ideas, that we will teach students how to talk with people who do not agree with them and to consider multiple points of view? Will we build that critical consciousness? Will we teach a well-rounded view of history that doesn't just talk about the experiences of some? When we have our fourth graders look at Oregon history, whose history is it? And is it a history that for the appropriateness of their age, but also opens them up to not every story turned out to be wonderful experiences that are going on? Do people in our schools know that Oregon was entered the United States as a state, as the only state that had exclusionary laws, that people who were Black and African American were not welcome to live in our state? Are those, parts of the history, not the entire history, but are there parts of the history that would help people understand why there is a social justice crisis, why there are people who are feeling that the systems do not treat them fairly? And if we aren't providing that kind of education, how is it that we do that? And how is it that we add culturally responsive education so that we have multiple modalities, multiple ways for students to work together, that we are building upon the collaborative spirit of many cultures, that people help each other to learn, and we don't see that as cheating, that only individual effort is what needs to go on. So there are some very important things that school boards can talk about to ensure that the practicing educators are really embracing a philosophy of equitable education that is good for everyone. And then in the article, it kind of ended with some of the work that came out of the Eugene School District, but other districts as well. How do we take an equity pause with each decision that we're making so that we really go through a deliberate way of saying, who are the stakeholders? Who are the different people that this is going to affect? And have we meaningfully engaged them? When Michael talked about being able to have these forums for people to come in, that should be the norm, not the exception, that we're getting a variety of stakeholder input. What's really the purpose? What are we trying to achieve? And is there an equitable priority in that outcome? And how does it affect groups differently? And if it affects groups differently, who's going to be helped and who's going to be harmed? Why would we move forward if we hadn't considered what are some of the unintended but likely consequences that come up with our bus routes, with our timing of when schools take place, with our policies that we have from the school board? And then, as Justin really talked about, when we look at anything, whether it's data or not, what are the root causes? Let's get underneath the surface and be able to look at it. Then you all have a real responsibility on sustainability. If these are priorities, how do we sustain them and make them realistic? And yes, there are trade-offs, but we're always moving in the right direction, not trading off that will abandon our equity for some other priority, but we'll see, okay, we're going to come up with a creative option. And then how will we measure success? And how will we make sure that the variety of stakeholders are involved in measuring that success? So one of the things that organizations and boards such as yours have said, we need to be able to, be facile in the work that we do in order to come up with our policies and practices, what we approve and those kinds of things, and periodically take a deep breath and pause and say, let's put our equity lens on very deliberately and have the equity conversation so that then we are really making a decision that is based on our internalized mindset about being equity-minded leaders. How might this tool or which of these aspects seem different that maybe are worthy now of perhaps considering taking a pause to consider? I often hear that the sustainable one is what just drives people to say, yes, but we have to be realistic about what it is that we do. And I am forever one that, yeah, realistic now, setting the stage for, again, incrementally, how is it that we will move forward with adequate funding to meet the needs of each student, and having those kinds of courageous conversations. Something to ponder.
So one of the questions that we tend to use within our cabinet is who's advantaged and who's disadvantaged by this decision that we're making, which is similar to a few of the questions, just slightly worded slightly different. And that in and of itself starts the conversation about, well, how would we know? How would we measure who's advantaged? What does that look like? Advantage, what do you mean? And I think it's really difficult when you get into, it's very difficult for people to engage really with any of these questions, because in order to answer them, to have an answer, you have to admit that there is not an equal really amount of thought given to the different student groups that you're discussing, that you're addressing. Because what comes naturally to me as a white woman is what I've always known as a white woman. So I don't have to think about the advantages that I have, nor do I have to think about how that oppresses other people who don't have those advantages. I have to force myself to do that, right? Whereas people who are oppressed, they get to see that all the time, whenever it happens to them, right? But I don't have to notice it if I'm not the one who's being oppressed. I don't need to notice it. And so simply as a white woman, having to sit down and acknowledge that there are actions within our school district for which I am ultimately responsible that are creating inequities and lack of access and lack of opportunity for our students and their families, that in and of itself is uncomfortable. And I think that makes these questions even more challenging if folks aren't really if they don't have their racial equity conversation muscle well practiced. And so sometimes that's talking about things that are much less important than whether how we set children up in third grade math is actually excluding them from AP calculus. That's a very hard conversation for people to have, because once you follow that through line, now you're having a very different discussion about the influence we are having on children's college opportunities when they're in elementary school.
The other thing for me is that all of these steps down through root causes sends me back to stakeholders, because I, as an individual, cannot answer all of these questions just alone. So for me, using this, even if I'm struggling through the decision-making process, acknowledging that I need to do a better job of getting input from a variety of stakeholders and broadening that helps me build the system. So even though I'm struggling with this decision, each time that I go back and I start to check on those stakeholders and I start to really look at what is the purpose and who is it that we're serving and those kinds of things, I'm building a system that is going to be more inclusive. And that's part of my equity lens. So there are a couple of things that you are already working on that have equity at the center of the work, and the Student Success Act certainly is part of it. And I assume that part of the forums that you did last spring may have stemmed from some of the work that the Oregon Department of Education is having all school districts do around the Student Success Act. So again, we know that when we formalize equity as a goal, then people attend to it. So part of the work of the school board is then to formalize that equity is part of the work so that we will continue to do it, and piggybacking on the work that we're required to do anyway through the Student Success Act is part of it, to define and support quality instruction and equitable instruction. All of those mindsets that we go through is a part of quality teaching, and demonstrating a passion for teaching is part of that, getting the heart and the minds of people together to build a culture that teaching is really about serving each student well, and that looking over here at the authentic inclusion and engagement of historically underserved students, reaching out to families. All of those things that you're trying to do should not be seen as just being done, for the Success Act, but really the foundation of the work that you're doing across the district. And then with the implementation of All Students Belong, and the having the conversations about hate symbols, and that everyone has a right to learn, work, and participate in environments that are safe and free of discrimination, really will necessitate that every adult that works in our schools and students who attend our schools and volunteers who come in are engaged in those conversations that ultimately lead us to having those conversations about equity. So not everything we face can be changed, but if we don't face it, then nothing can be changed. And so I think it is overwhelming. And I know I talked a lot tonight and bombarded you with lots and lots of thinking, but that is more to help us understand that when we internalize this, as opposed to seeing it as a separate item on the agenda or a separate priority, but really a foundational, non-negotiable in what we do in public education, it will become easier for us to face those kinds of challenges that we know we have. And that because it is that relationship between our espoused goal of equality, where each and every student, feels that acceptance and inclusion, we know there are equity steps that have to take place. And so with school board leadership and you all having those kinds of conversations, it will guide what's going on. And then in partnership with your district leadership, we really start to formalize that this is who we are as a school district. And so our actions have to inspire others to dream more, learn more, and do more. And that's what it means to be a leader. So we can't do it all, but the work that you do should have that ripple effect out to others to say, yes, this is what we're about. This is what we do. We want to hear in those school reports when you come to report to us what you're doing there. We want to celebrate with you when you are starting to make some equitable steps, and we want to strategize with you when you're struggling to do those kinds of things. And so hard work is not the key to the success, but hard work is. So we have to be able to share the burden of doing the work with the gift of saying, this is who we are, this is the work that we do, putting our hearts and our minds together, really reaching out to all of our spheres of influence to make this important. As we leave, I suggest that journaling for equity leadership is important, because just in those few moments that you can take to take a deep breath, to say in self-reflection, how are you questioning your assumptions and habits, and asking how you're dealing with the world around you? What information do you want to gather? What processes, what's going on? What's really challenging you, and those kinds of things, so that equity becomes a more normal way that you're talking about everything that is going on. And again, I know that I gave lots and lots of things to think about, and there are probably a myriad of questions, some provocative things that we can certainly discuss. So I'll be contacting each of the board members to see if you would like to voluntarily have a conversation with me. It'll be confidential, just between the two of us. I'm just, someone who has been on this journey of equity and those kinds of things, but you also know what you're about as an individual and as a school board member and as a community member. And if there's any way that I can help you process what's going on, dig in a little bit deeper, challenge things that I've said tonight, so that we can have those conversations and still be able to move forward, I'll be reaching out to you, and that's certainly a voluntary thing. Then we do have 2 additional times to do some equity work on March 17th and May 28th. And part of my conversations with you will be to be discerning, what would be most helpful to you in topics and moving forward, looking at something very specific, or perhaps getting more background information so that you feel comfortable in having those kinds of equity conversations. With that, if anyone has questions or comments, it's been a fast and furious couple of hours, but I hope that you found a couple of nuggets that prompt your thinking.
I'm always surprised at how quickly the 2 hours goes and how much information we seem to have gained in 2 hours. But I just want to say thank you again for the time. I know you have a lot of background and a lot of information, and we appreciate you sharing it with us. And especially for doing the one-on-one sessions as well, because we get a lot out of those, I think. And that's, time away for you, and we appreciate that very much. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate you. As I said last time, my kids went through this system. I live here in Albany, and so it's really my community, and I want to be part of the solution seeking as well.
Any questions from board members? Comments?
Eric had to stand up visually.
Say again.
Can I get a copy of these slides? Would you mind emailing them?
Yeah, when we talk, I'll talk about how we can share information.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
There's a lot of great quotes in there too that we want to be able to utilize.
Yeah.
Thanks, Elaine.
All
Really
right.
appreciated it.
So thank you all for allowing me the opportunity. I look forward to a time when we can actually meet in a group and have that kind of communal feeling instead of doing this over Zoom. But I appreciate that you all are committed to do it, even though this is a not ideal way to have a group conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think if we have no questions, I will go ahead and adjourn our meeting. 8:59 p.m. and we will see you all on Monday, correct? Yes.
And Melissa, first thing in the morning, early. I'll see you.